Welcome to my talk on tabletop RPGs. Specifically, I'm going to be talking today about the element that is key in this. So it is a role-playing game, and I'm going to be talking about playing a role. So for those of you who aren't aware of, what a TTRPG is, a tabletop role-playing game, well, there's a couple of very clear hints. It is a role-playing game. You take on the identity of a character, you play a role throughout the game. There are many versions of role-playing games that you will find in the world out there. The specific games that I'm talking about today are the ones that are played on the tabletop. So generally speaking, these are games that are played around a table with a group of other people who are all participating and playing a role of the character that they have chosen and created. It is usually mediated by and organized by a dungeon master or games master, and those people aren't playing a role. They're the ones that help carry the story along, and they provide the adversity that your characters will face. Some really good examples of TTRPGs, tabletop role-playing games, would be, the most obvious one is Dungeons and Dragons. So Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, created by Gary Gygax, was a way for him to delve deeper into fantasy lore and fantasy ideas, but make it a bit more engaging, a bit more interactive, a bit more you get to play the character, or you get to be somebody different, and that was very popular, and obviously it became very popular amongst what people would probably refer to now as nerd culture. Inspired by a lot of the great fantasy authors, like Tolkien is probably one of the masters of the art. Gary Gygax loves the lore that he built, the world building that was part of it, and decided he wanted to say, hey, why don't you take the opportunity to play one of those characters? And that's basically how tabletop RPGs came about. Dungeons and Dragons is the kind of first and foremost. It's one that most people would know and talk about if you're talking about a tabletop RPG. But there's also Pathfinder, which is kind of like the progeny of Dungeons and Dragons. It's slightly modified rules. It works on the same basis, the same similar setup, and it's played in a very similar way. It's just slightly different. But then there's other ones like that have taken Dungeons and Dragons and are modified in their own way. Call of Cthulhu was another one that has become quite prominent. There's also, I think, one called Into Darkness, and they're based on the same, pretty much the same concept. It's played on a table. There's maps and sometimes character little figurines, or sometimes people just use dice to represent a character. Sometimes it's played slightly differently in a way called theatre of the mind, where there's no maps and there's no physical anything. It's all done in the imagination of the characters, of the participants, the players. There is also spin-offs like Star Wars RPG and Star Trek RPG, and pretty much any other franchise that you can think of have come up with their own tabletop RPG that's based on the same set of rules, same kind of concept. The basic concepts of a tabletop RPG are that you create a character, and that character is your own invention. So again, it's kind of set up with there's a bunch of options and availabilities that you can use to create that character. You stick within a set realm, otherwise it kind of gets a bit too crazy. You create that character, and each character has a set of ability scores. Now, I'm going to talk specifics. I'm going to talk Dungeons and Dragons, but these vary from game to game. The ability scores are how good your character is at certain abilities. So you can see on the screen there that you've got 6 abilities. They are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And those those make up the skill set of your character. They are a number out of 20 usually, and then each score out of 20 gives an ability modifier. So for example, if you've got a high strength, that means that when it comes to the game time, that improves any kind of check that you have to do related to strength by a set amount. I'm not going to get too deep into the mechanics of the specifics of the game because that's not really what this is about. I'm just trying to give you a bit of an idea of what happens within a tabletop role-playing game. So once you've got your ability scores, then you're able to choose your class and race. Again, this is from a set list usually. Class is the type of character that you are, and again, we're talking about fantasy, specifically with D&D, but with other games like Star Trek or Star Wars or something, it would be, the class would be slightly different. Like you'd have Jedi, you'd have other supporting characters, you'd have magic users, you'd have fighters, things like that. But class is like, some examples might be a wizard who uses magic, casts spells, or you have a fighter, somebody who is like, if you want to take a Tolkien reference, that would be like Aragorn. He's the he'll run into a battle and he'll have a sword and he'll be able to fist fight his way through things. You have barbarians, you have rogues who are slightly more stealthy. Again, stick with the same kind of theme of Lord of the Rings. Legolas would probably fit as a rogue because he fires from a distance, he uses his bow and arrow, he's very good at stealth. So that's what your class is. And then your race is the species that your character is. So again, this could be any variant of a multitude of different races that are all part of the world in which you're playing. But some common examples, specifically with D&D, and again, you'll see the thread of how close it is to Tolkien, but you have humans, you have orcs, you have elves, you have dwarves, you have the slightly obscure ones, like there's a race called Tabaxi, which is actually a race of cat people. There's tieflings, who are actually demi-demons, so they're from a demonic plane, and all of these races can be played as part of your character when you build it. And then following that, you come up with personality traits and a way to build a backstory and flesh out your character. So you see on the right hand side there, so part of the character sheets, the building blocks for the characters in Dungeons and Dragons, is that they'll have personality traits, they'll have ideals, they'll have bonds, and they'll have flaws. And each of these, as I say, they build up the backstory of the character, but they also really influence how you play the character. And that's really what I wanted to be talking about today, is when you build a character, you really have to play it. You have to immerse yourself into what they are like as a character, as a participant in this storyline. Once you've got your character, you're able to go on an adventure. Obviously, you have to learn the rules to the game in which you're playing. So whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or any of the other RPGs, you have to learn how to play it. But once you have that character built, you are able to go on an adventure. Those adventures could be anything. They can be short, one-shot skirmishes or fights or challenges that they have to complete, or they can be long-standing campaigns that go on for years and years. Just as an example, the campaigns that I've played in the last year, 2 years, mostly last about 3 or 4 months, playing regularly once a week. The one we're doing at the moment is, I think we are 14 sessions in. We're on level 3 of a 23 level dungeon. So as a whole, this one will probably take up to 3 or 4 years to complete, of playing once a week, every week. So it gives you an idea of the scope that you can play. You can play a one shot in one night, like I did in the past with employees from VHS. We spent 3 hours doing one dungeon, as it were, and then you can go up to ones that last forever, essentially. Some people run their own campaigns, they've built themselves, they're set on the set on the rules of Dungeons and Dragons in the world of Faerun, which is the world that Dungeons and Dragons takes place in, and they just come up with their own stories and they just keep it on going and keep it on going and keep it on going. So once you've got your character, you can go on an adventure, and that's what that means. Actually playing a game, it's really important to remember that the crux of this is a role-playing game. So you are playing a role. Everything depends on the abilities of your characters. So what that means is, if your character's not got a high strength score, then it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to open a rusted gate or face off against a strong opponent in a grappling match. And that really does impact the choices that you make as the player relating to the role-playing part of the game. Your character's personality will obviously play a massive part in that as well. I've got a few examples that I'm going to show you, but it's funny because a human's personality, the player's personality, can often take over. But when you're role playing, you're playing the role, you have to remember what your character's personality is like. Each character has what's called an alignment, and that's one of the three, either lawful, neutral, or evil. Lawful, neutral, or chaotic, and then good, neutral, or evil. And then your character will be two of those. So lawful evil, lawful neutral, lawful good, or chaotic good, chaotic neutral, chaotic evil, such as the alignment goes. And those will implement your decisions as a character. So for example, a chaotic neutral person or character may not really care if a lot of people are getting murdered by the enemies, but they might. Whereas a lawful good person would see a town getting burnt down by a raving horde of orcs and be like, that can't happen, I've got to do something about it. And that's influences the personality. The personality influences the choices that your character makes and the choices that you have to make as the player playing the character. And that brings me around to playing your character. So it's really important that when you're playing a game like this, your decisions aren't your own. Like I said, generally speaking, most people align to being good and somewhere in between lawful and neutral. So when enemies are attacking, the instinct for most players is to be like, hey, that's bad, I'm going to fight against you. But if your character is a chaotic evil character, then they're likely not going to care too much. Or they may even, because they're chaotic, make the decision to join in with the roving horde of orcs and start slaughtering civilians. Again, this is all based on the character that you've created and the personality traits and the alignment that they have. And that's one thing that you have to do when you're playing the game, is you have to consider your character first. You have to almost suppress your own personal reactions and consider more what your character would do. And that means avoiding this something called metagaming, but it also means avoiding critical thinking. So for example, if you've got a character that has really low intelligence there, and you think, as the player, you think, oh, if I climbed up to this area, I would have a really good chance of taking out targets with my bow and arrow. If your character doesn't have the high intelligence enough to think about that, then you shouldn't be doing that as the character. And that in itself is an element of critical thinking that you might apply in your personal life or your personal approach, but you can't do with your character. And that's also another level of metagaming, where you think, oh, well, I know that this worked before for somebody else, so I'm going to try it as my character. That's something you have to really try and avoid. I've got a few examples that I'm going to show now. These are all characters that I've created. So let's just check. We have Grillrim, we have Kaiser, and we have Sinva. So the Grillrim is a mountain dwarf who is a bard, kind of an odd combination there. Kaiser is a very boring half-orc barbarian, and Simva is a tiefling wizard. So what we have there is the names, obviously in capitals, their race, which is mountain dwarf, half-orc, and tiefling, and then their class, which is bard, barbarian, and wizard. And again, when you're creating your character, you come up with these personality traits, and those will influence your decisions. So when we look at the personality traits, oh, I don't want that, thank you. I want that. Just let me select it. So personality traits, ideals, and flaws. So this is Simva. Simva's personality traits are the common folk love me for my kindness and generosity. My ideals are responsibility. It's my duty to depend on, to respect the authority of those above me. Bonds are nothing is more important than my members of family, and the flaws, I hide a truly scandalous secret that could ruin my family forever. So those 4 things are really going to impact the decisions that the character makes when they're playing the role, whilst you are playing them. So an example would be their ideals are that they respect authority. If they're given a command by their superior and it goes against something that their decision, like what you think might be bad as the player, you have to do it because the character is motivated by their own personality, and they would complete that action that was given to them by their superior. Kaiser is the half-orc barbarian. Again, this one, he's lawful. His ideals, I don't steal from others in the trade. He makes the decisions that he will not steal from others. So if you're on an adventure and you decide that you're going to go and steal something off a character or a non-player character that you encounter, he would be against this. He would fight against this, and you as the player have to play that role. I'm going to skip the next one because I know I'm getting very close to running out of time. In the game itself, there's a lot of things. This is kind of extraneous to playing the role, but just generally speaking, I want to talk about the game mechanics so that people get a bit more of an idea of what the game is like. It is all about the dice. So there are several different dice. I don't know if you can see my camera or not, but I have a set of dice that I can show to people once I finish presenting. The most important dice in all of those is a D20. When I talked about the ability scores, I said it was out of a score of 20. The D20 is the main one that you would roll if you are making an attack or if you are making a check on any multitude of different things. But there's all sorts of things like there's acrobatics and athletics. There's also wisdom. There's also perception. There's also investigation. So if you walk into a room that's, all messed up and people have knocked books everywhere, you would be asked by the dungeon master to roll for investigation, and that would be a roll of the D20. The rest of the dice are, generally speaking, ones that are to do with damage or to do with they're all generally to do with damage, actually. So you've got the D8, 8-sided dice, D12, D10, D4, D6. There's another D10 there, which you'll notice it has multiples of 10. So when that and the other D10 are combined, you can roll both of those and it becomes a D100. So it's a percentile set of dice. I did mention it briefly, but the dice are used for ability rolls, as I mentioned. So that's any sort of check, but also any sort of attack roll, and they are also used for damage rolls. So that's the smaller die are used for damage rolls. If you are interested in finding out any more, there are plenty of resources. D&D Beyond is one that is really prominent right now. There's actually a way of creating characters. The character sheets that I just showed you were displayed on D&D Beyond. Very good website. You can get a lot of free information there. There's actually got a platform for playing D&D as well. My preferred platform for playing D&D online is Roll20, roll20.net. It's a place where you can create your character sheet and maps can be uploaded, and you move little tokens around and you roll dice virtually through the platform. And then there's a few other places where there's lots of good resources. So dnd.wizards.com is very good. That one's actually the Wizards of the Coast, the creators of Dungeons and Dragons. That's their official one, dnd.wizards.com. And then there's lots of other resources and wikis that are online. So dnd5e.wikidot.com is very good. And there's 5esrd.com, which is, again, they're fan created, but generally very good and free. Access to all of the information that you would really need to play the game. I run over a little bit, but I think I've hit my 20 minutes and I managed to get through everything. So hooray! I shall open up the floor for questions.
If the player were to make a move that were uncharacteristic for them, what might the DM do about that?
That's a great question, and actually that's something that comes up quite a lot in D&D communities. It's like, from the DM's point of view, the Dungeon Master's point of view, like how do I get the players to play their roles properly? And that it can be solved in a few different ways. Generally speaking, the DM can just kind of quietly say, like, ask them, what's your intelligence? They can say, you probably wouldn't see that, your character probably wouldn't see that as an option, and then just flat out roll. The DM also has last say on anything. So if as a player you could ask, would my character see this as an opportunity, and the DM would say, what's your intelligence, and they'd say, oh, it's 8. It's like, no, probably not then. Or the DM could be a bit more creative about it, and like you say, they could say, all right, your character sees that as an option, but roll an athletics check to be able to scale the tower, and that could be where where it comes in. Or they'd ask them to roll something different to, hang on, let me bring up, I have a character sheet here. So on the character sheet, there's all of these different things down here are different abilities that are linked to the main abilities. So you could get them to roll an investigation check to see if that character is able to spot a better vantage point, or get them to roll an athletics check to be able to climb up, or an acrobatics check to be able to climb up, or even a perception check to see if they are wise enough to notice something like that. So there's all sorts of different ways that the DM could govern it, and but generally speaking, most DMs would just be like, yeah, your character probably wouldn't be able to do that. But again, that's why it's a role-playing game. It's for you to self-govern.
Do you find that people want to play characters that are similar to themselves?
That's a great question. I think the first time somebody plays, they generally tend to create a character that is very similar to themselves. I know that's what I did when I first started playing, and the few people that I've introduced to it, when we've talked about creating a character, they do create something that's very similar to themselves, but like with minor twists that kind of pique their fantastical interests. But the more people play, the more they see what different characters are like, different races are like, different classes are like they tend to step more out of their comfort zone, and obviously you'll get some people who are like, well, I'm going to play Dungeons and Dragons, so I'm going to play something that's completely not me, and I think that in itself offers a really interesting escape for a lot of people. It's the whole point of fantasy is that it is fantasy. It's an escape from normality, but certainly when we're talking about playing a role, I think a lot of people, if they go into it, they want to play something that they're more comfortable with, and they feel that they're more able to play. Like, I've played characters in the past that chaotic neutral or chaotic evil, and it's really challenging. Like, it's really hard for me to not think I've got to be the good guy. And it's just generally because I like to play the good guy. I'm sure lots of people think that way, but like genuinely trying to play a chaotic evil character is really tough, because it also impacts everything else that goes on in the game with your cohort, like whoever else is in your party. Your decisions are going to impact them as well, so you have to be really committed to it to play that role. But it does depend. Honestly, it depends on the person. It depends on how comfortable they are with the game and the mechanics, how much they're willing to learn, how much they're willing to jump into the game and the role. But generally speaking, I think first timers usually gravitate towards a character that is more similar to themselves. But thank you again, great question.
You said your campaign could run for 3 years or more. What are the factors that impact that length? Is there a minimum number of players?
Minimum number of people is 2. You need a dungeon master and at least 1 player. I do know of one other person who works for the company who is playing a solo campaign. It's just them and a DM, and they're having a great time. My party is me and 4 other guys. Hang on. Me and 3 other guys and then the DM, so there's 5 of us total. As to why it's going to take so long, it's because it's a massive campaign. It's built to be a huge campaign. So there's 23 different levels of this dungeon, and each level has its own traps. It has its own sets of enemies. It has its own interwoven storylines throughout all of the levels, but also between levels as well. So when I say dungeon, I literally mean like you go down a tunnel and there's this big sprawling labyrinth that's all on the same level, like the same story. And there's places for you to go and discover, and there's places for you to fight enemies. There's places for you to find treasure, to meet non-player characters. Those are characters that are part of the storyline. And this one is just enormous. Like we started it. As I said, the previous campaigns have taken 3 or 4 months, playing once a week every week. This one's just a massive campaign. It's called the Mad Mage's Dungeon, and it's called that for a reason, because it turns a lot of people insane. Yeah. It is great fun, and it's like it's this massive interwoven storytelling thing that's part of D&D that's so brilliant about it, is that you can have a campaign that's really short and it's just like you need to rescue a princess from the castle, or you can have something that's based on an entire world and you have to travel from one location to another, encounter loads of different NPCs and battle people, but also you have to charm your way through stuff, and you have to convince people of doing things, and you have to backstab and betray. It's just it's brilliant.